Hello and welcome to this Hackney Museum podcast. My name is Chris Nathaniel. I'm the programme lead for Hackney Young Curators. Hackney Museum's exhibition Block by Block was devised by our two young curators, Audrey Campillo and Khan Hark. The exhibition opened in September 2023 and closed in January 2024 and focused on two estates in the east of the borough, Trowbridge and Clapton Park. I caught up with the two young curators to hear about their process and talk about the history and legacy of Hackney social housing. Hi you two, thanks for joining. I wondered if you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Hello, my name's Khan Hark.
And I'm Audrey Campillo.
Thanks, you two. So the process of defining what your exhibition centred on, that involved quite a few things. So there was engaging with the collection and the store at the museum and also with Hackney Archives. I'm wondering what was important to you in telling the story of social housing? What did you want to get across within the exhibition?
And one of the things that we really wanted to make clear in the exhibition was sort of the origins of the cycles of housing. In the exhibition, you see a progression from the inception and then, the disrepair and then eventually the demolition. And there is like quite a contrast between these like Rachel White-Reed photos, which are quite bleak.
And then we have like this really sort of fancy like CEI Demolition Day poster, which is like the most 90s thing to exist.
Incredibly colourful, gaudy, even. We love it. And in this exhibition, we're also trying to emphasise the effect this has on the real people who live there. I mean, you've got your dad on the video talking about his experience, but also in a lot of the photos, when we were choosing photos, we did try to include photographs that were taken either by ordinary people and tenants like Danny McLaughlin, who really kindly contributed a photograph that he took on the day of the Trowbridge demolition, but also lots of other photographs that like show life as it was.
Thanks, that's great. So you mentioned this timeline as an important narrative device for the exhibition. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how that timeline started. What was the beginning of council housing in Britain and Hackney as well, and why did it come about? And I know that through your research, the Second World War played a big part in that as well. So yeah, over to you both to talk a little about that.
I mean, the very first ones, the very first council homes, as opposed to tower blocks, were built in 1919.
But yeah, basically, it was under David Lloyd George and his housing schemes, and it was known as the Housing and Town Planning Act and the Addison Act, and it entailed, well, the planned construction of 500,000 homes. They ended up only building 25,000. But yeah.
And then all this changed, obviously, everything in housing changed after the Second World War. 2,250,000 people homeless, which obviously meant that housing was a priority for post-war governments. In 1951, the government declared it the first of the social services.
Yeah, and sort of at Hackney itself, like during the war's course, like more than 700 bombs were dropped in total, and in the areas of Trowbridge and Clapton Park, there's sort of specific stories to where they were bombed, where with Clapton Park, the area used to be like a timber processing yard, right? And that was targeted during the early stages of the Blitz. And whereas Trowbridge was mainly just a street of just low-level terraced homes. I have a quote from like Harold Wilson, where it's the Prime Minister during the 60s when these buildings were built, and it's all about housing plans having like a similar sort of dynamizing effect as people's rush to total war, essentially, like committing to housing for a government is similar to committing to war. That sort of thing. Yeah, it's something. Yeah, there's a quote. Just as in war, the idea of common purpose had a dynamizing effect, so possibly the launch of a great housing plan could have a similar effect today. The housing minister under Wilson's Labour was Richard Crosman, and similar to sort of Lloyd George in the late 1910s, he promised that there would be a housing drive of over 400,000 homes. Projects like Trowbridge and Clapton Park, they were seen as like yardsticks of success, that it worked.
Well, they seem quite monumental.
Yeah.
Don't they?
So you just spoke about the monumentality, and having looked at plans and images and film of the estates and the blocks for quite a while, I'm wondering what you both make of their design, really, of their architecture.
I mean, the architecture itself is quite divisive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you like it? I'm quite fond of it.
I mean, I do think it's a bit cold and sterile, but it also, I guess, it aligns with sort of the moods of the era that they're in.
Yeah. Some say sterile, some say clean and
Clean
orderly.
effects, yeah.
But there's obviously lots of different opinions on this. Like two conflicting quotes that we've got here. Terence Davies, rest in peace, talking about, quote, municipal architecture dispiriting at the best of times, but when combined with the British genius for creating the dismal, makes for a cityscape that is anything but Elysian. And then on the other hand, you have Joseph Watson of the National Trust giving a different perspective, saying that this is not depressing architecture, that it's actually, quote, intended to be heroic architecture that offered the best of design to the masses, freed people from condemned slum housing, and elevated them literally to a better life.
Yeah, it's sort of the whole thing of ideology as well, of representing a sense of progress. They were made of like panels of concrete, like literal just cladded rectangles.
I mean, the uniformity of it as well definitely implies a sense of like containment. Everyone is living in an identical house. To some people, that seems like low effort, but then it's all about frame of mind, I guess.
Thanks. So part of your research was also looking at testimony and the opinion of residents who actually lived in those towers on Trowbridge and Clapton Park and Carn. Also, it was speaking with your dad as well, who lived in Clapton Park as well. What were the experiences for residents? I mean, during the 70s was quite a difficult time, in the 80s, in terms of how these blocks were maintained. So what were the common gripes and experiences for people living in these buildings?
It's like one of the most common complaints about tower blocks is that they're like completely isolating, because you don't really need to speak to your neighbours. There's a resident who says, this is Alice Burke, who lived on Nightingale Estates, that they're antisocial because if you're watching from the 21st floor and you see your kid fall down and get hurt, how long is it going to take you to go down and be with them?
Yeah, and seemingly there weren't just issues for residents in terms of day-to-day living, but there had actually been some deadly consequences to the poor design of some of the blocks. And I'm thinking about Ronan Point, which you mentioned in the exhibition. I wondered if you could briefly speak about what happened at Ronan Point and the impact that had.
So the Ronan Point explosion happened in 1968. The moment when like the opinion on council housing really pivoted. Essentially, a woman on the top floor was turning her gas on, and there was a gas explosion, and one entire corner of the building essentially collapsed in just like a giant
like
domino
a
effect.
Deck of cards, right?
Yes,
sort of,
it did.
yeah.
Which is kind of like quite dark, because if you look at the technical guidance from 1968, which was given to builders, it states, one can hardly overemphasize the absolute necessity of effectively joining the various components of the structure together in order to obviate any possible tendency for it to behave like a house of cards. So there is a pretty clear link.
Thanks. So the exhibition then moves from talking about the genesis of those estates in particular and how they kind of came of age, really, to the more terminal decline, I guess, in the early 80s. And what was going on there in terms of funding, how these estates were managed? What was kind of the wider issue at the time?
So you think of like the early 80s and sort of a time of near social chaos in East London. There's like a great film called Babylon, and I'd recommend. It's by Franco Rosso, and that it really, from what me and my dad watched it like a couple of years back, and he said it really captured the era quite well. That sort of new wave of like immigrant youth culture clashing against like the London of old. By 1982, like 2.5 million were unemployed. Like that's near like the peaks of the Great Depression during the 30s. Right, and Hackney had like the largest proportion of overcrowded households and the second highest sort of male unemployment in the entire country in like the 70s and 80s. These estates sort of become hotbeds for disenfranchised people.
I mean, it sort of
right?
exacerbates the effect which was already happening, in which like the more unemployment and the more homelessness you have, the more you can only give these homes to the most desperate people.
Yeah.
Which then increases the chances of there being issues with crime. These again, politicians have less motivation.
You see, like, where sort of these places. You essentially the situation sort of pushed people to a wall, right? There's no real mobility. There's no real sense of hope for work or any sort of peace. Again, it's sort of time to Brixton riots as well. That there's all these sort of cultural undercurrents, and where are sort of disenfranchised young people exactly meant to turn to in a situation like that, other than sort of crime and community? It's not a justification, but it's an explanation of why that sort of thing grew in Hackney at that time.
It also leads into what happened in the 90s, because a lot of these estate, quote, renewal, unquote, plans did really include like a lot of youth programs and trying to saying that one of the reasons that these things were happening were because they were trying to curb crime, because they were trying to get residents more involved, because etc. etc. They wanted there to be more of a sense of community. So their idea of like one of the ideas of how to get these things to happen was to just completely knock down the tower blocks. But then that wasn't every single estate. This was part of a greater plan, which did include renovating places and also installing more security and etc.
Thanks. So we've metaphorically reached the end of your exhibition in a sense. The writing is really on the wall for many of these estates in Hackney. And towards the end of your exhibition, you move into that demolition phase and the CEI in particular. And what was the role of Hackney in the CEI?
So the CEI is the Comprehensive Estates Initiative. In the early 90s, it's sort of at its peak, and it is assessing 5 council estates, and there is a budget of £200 million to demolish and assess and improve these estates in general. And these are like the most urgent cases. So Clapton Park and New Kingshold are demolished in 1992 and 93, not very far apart. And the other estates, Trowbridge, Holly Street, and Nightingale, also like massive changes. And people really do notice, like a lot of the artists in the exhibition, like Rachel White-Reed, are responding to this, and just like housing in general in the 90s. But also like everyday people are like showing up, and it's sort of like it's advertised as a celebration. And in the exhibition, we do include photos taken by ordinary people of these estates being demolished as the button is being pushed.
But it's sort of like the level of disrepair these estates were in by like the 90s and such, right? That, again, there's something about them being sort of they're essentially labyrinths. They're difficult to police, where crime and activity can sort of just happen there easily. That facilities break, the heating fails a lot. Lifts break down, there's infestations. It's all very poorly managed, essentially. Like, going from estate to estate, for Trowbridge at least, people were much more sort of resistant to the demolition, right? That more should be served to just actually properly maintain the buildings. Whereas by the time of like Clapton Park's end, most people were sort of happy just to see it let it go. They probably put more effort into like tearing the buildings down than they did to necessarily put them up in the first place.
And you do wonder how much of this was avoidable.
Yeah, if just things had been planned better earlier on, or if like the political situation, the social situation was a lot different during the 80s and the late 70s.
So a lot of these blocks are now being retrofitted, and not just with safer windows or insulation, but also the cladding due to Grenfell.
Yeah, there's Grenfell sort of left its own sort of legacy in the way housing is viewed, and rightly so, right? It's sort of another example of how these buildings can be just mismanaged so terribly. I don't know, I guess for all sort of generating Grenfell's like this really weird pathway image that happened in 2017, so we were all like 10, 11, around there, right?
Yeah.
We just saw like this half burnt out tower just sort of jutting out of everything. Shocking and a bit terrifying to see.
There's a film called London from 1994, and it's sort of like it's not really a documentary, but it's just like a voiceover combined with lots of images of London. And something that the narrator notes is that this building, which has been bombed by the IRA, which is like all the windows, the glass is completely gone, is actually quite indistinguishable from all the buildings that which are constantly like in construction in the city. And it sort of is just like in London specifically, there's just like this sense that constantly demolishing things and things constantly being destroyed is somehow just as key to progress as things being constantly built.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to highlight, that relentless cycle of development and progress in quotations. I really like to thank both of you for outlining your process and how you found the curatorial experience. I think it's been really insightful. Yeah, so thanks to both of you, and we'll end things here, and thank you for listening.